pausa no seu podcast para contar que chegou o novo Peugeot 2008, um carro que impressiona até quem já viu de tudo. Conheça uma experiência de puro prazer em dirigir com acabamento sofisticado e design inconfundível. Descubra como conforto e tecnologia podem elevar o nível da sua experiência de direção. Conheça o novo Peugeot 2008 e deixe a inspiração te guiar.
Welcome back to the Philosophemes podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalambrino. I'm proud to be part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Thank you for being here. I'm very happy to be sharing this topic with you. This is one of my favorite topics, the topic of authenticity in existentialism. And I feel as though authenticity is very easy to jumble up, right? And, I had, as always, every time I start to do any philosophy, I think it's like a desire for efficiency or something. But every time I engage in any philosophy, I find myself working on the research, working on the material as if I'm working up a book. And that does not lend itself to making podcast episodes. So in this episode, rather than get heavy into the scholarship regarding Sartre and Heidegger and so on, the goal is to look at some key passages and gain some insights, and hopefully the episode as a totality will be thought-provoking for us, right? And so one of the ways we could think about the difference between authenticity in French existentialism and authenticity in German existentialism is if we imagine a kind of line, right? And on the far left of that line would be Simone de Beauvoir, and on the far right of that line would be Martin Heidegger. And closer to the middle on the left would be Sartre, and closer to the middle on the right would be Gabriel Marcel. And I'm picking on just the contemporary existentialists at this point. At the same time, though, I think if we were to try to add in Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and Schelling and Schopenhauer, for example, these kinds of thinkers, we would find them on the right side of the line. All right, so I'm whenever I think about Simone de Beauvoir, my go-to scholar is Dr. Skye Cleary. And I have Dr. Cleary's book, How to Be Authentic, Simone de Beauvoir and the Quest for Fulfillment in front of me. And I have invited Dr. Cleary onto the show. I'm waiting to hear back from her. She's looking at her schedule. And I understand, I want to say just a couple of things about this real quick, is that I understand that, we may have different political views, we may have different religious views. I guess that doesn't stop Peterson and Bishop Barron. But Dr. Cleary and I may have different ideas about culture and politics. However, I think that it would be beneficial for us to have this conversation in regard to the philosophers of the future. And what I mean by that is that for the sake of people in the future looking back and trying to understand what is existentialism and how to think of their own lives, their own existence in terms of existential philosophy, I think that for that sake, it would be wonderful for Dr. Cleary and I to have a conversation about existentialism. So I'm hoping that happens. If it doesn't happen on the podcast, maybe it can happen down the road in print. But I'm so busy now with audio visual stuff. So having said all that, a couple quick ways to characterize the difference between authenticity in French existentialism and authenticity in German existentialism. And I'm essentially identifying, even though Gabriel Marcel is, of course, a French existentialist, and of course his thinking very much rings like French thinking, it's still the case that when it comes to authenticity, I think that he is closer to Heidegger than he is to Sartre. I think he would not have a problem with me were he alive, of course, he wouldn't have a problem with me saying that about his philosophy either. So simply put, you could say something like this, and I think that this is completely consistent with Dr. Cleary's book as well, that the French existentialists tend to associate authenticity with freedom, and the German existentialists tend to associate authenticity with being. And so one of the things that we find whenever we try to think deeper into this, because I think as existentialists, right, being and freedom come right along with one another here. So when we think about this, one of the ways to get clear as to not only the difference, but why it's the case that I think that the more authentic understanding of existential authenticity is actually found with the German existentialists. Why is that the case? I think it's the case because what you find, and I'm going to read a few passages here with you, but what you find is that when you follow the French existentialists and you associate authenticity with freedom, then you end up requiring input from the world that is less necessary when you think about authenticity in terms of being. So what does this mean, right? So let's take a look at a passage in Dr. Cleary's book. This is on page 6 of Dr. Cleary's book. Dr. Cleary writes, "The opposite of authenticity is inauthenticity, sometimes called bad faith, which means to deny one's own or others' freedom." And so what we find here is that when someone is not free to be who they want to be in the world, when we find someone who isn't able to identify the way that they want to be identified in the world, then it seems as though these French existentialists want to say that therefore that person is being forced to be inauthentic, that person is forced into a kind of a mode of inauthenticity. And here on page 7, let's read one more little passage here. It says, "One might argue that it's bad faith to suggest that there are external limitations on our freedom. But to ignore limitations entirely is like a scene in a horror movie where a torturer chops off a captive's feet and then says they are free to go. It's the same with meritocracy and white privilege. Working hard doesn't always lead to success for many people because of systemic racist obstacles. If you don't have the power to act on your freedom, then it's a shallow notion of freedom. You have to be free from oppression in order to be free to reach for authenticity." And so the first thought that crossed my mind was Viktor Frankl, right? And these stories about how any act of defiance or rebellion against the Nazi persecutors, as Viktor Frankl tells us, that any of those acts were seen as acts of freedom. And so I think that, notice that what we have here is that already immediately with the extreme French version of authenticity here, we find that French authenticity found in Simone de Beauvoir, it requires a reflection in the world. The being requires a reflection in the world. The being must see its reflection in the world in order to identify itself as being authentic. And of course, that's not the case with the German understanding of authenticity. The German understanding of authenticity is internal to being itself. When you have a revelation of your own being, right? When you have a revelation that you are being in the world, this is less dependent on any kind of identity that is in the world. And if we think about, as Dr. Cleary pointed out here, the association with inauthenticity and bad faith in Jean-Paul Sartre as being a nothingness, if we think about Sartre's comments about the waiter, right? The waiter there's a person who is pretending, in essence, to be a waiter, and in taking orders from the customers, this person is playing at being a waiter. And Sartre wants to say that, well, the person can't be a waiter in the way that a glass of water is a glass of water. And so therefore, there is some kind of, again, some kind of dependence on something external, some sort of dependence on the other. And I think that is a tendency in French philosophy, but that's not the case with the German understanding of authenticity. So, for example, from the point of view of Heidegger's Being in Time, it is possible for someone to be authentic and be a waiter, right? It is not necessarily the case that the individual who is doing a job, or that the individual who is participating in the world in such a way that they gain some worldly identity. It's not the case that they are lost in that worldly identity, nor is it the case that they forget necessarily. I mean, that would be inauthenticity, right? It's not necessarily the case that they forget their own being while they are being such and such in the world, whatever they are being in the world. I think that in and of itself, that in a nutshell, shows you the distinction between the French existential understanding of authenticity and the German existential understanding of authenticity. But let's take a look at how the German understanding of authenticity gets there, right? So when we think about, and if anyone who's ever read any Heidegger knows that Heidegger is always up to this. Heidegger is always criticizing Descartes, and Heidegger rightly identifies Descartes. Schelling was the first person to really emphasize this. But Heidegger is right to identify Descartes as the origin of so many of these problems. And of course, as we've said in other places, as I've written in many publications, Jean-Paul Sartre, I just put out the YouTube video on haunting a body in free fall toward nothingness, Jean-Paul Sartre's Being in Nothingness. So many of these French philosophers are following Descartes either explicitly or implicitly. So when we think about this is relevant because when we ask what was Descartes doing, what was he up to? And Descartes was searching for a foundation, right? An Archimedean point, if you will, a foundation to the new science, as it was being called. And this endeavor, in many ways, was already established in the Italian Renaissance by Bernardino Talisio and Tommaso Campanella. But Descartes gets credit for this, and really Descartes may also be seen as stealing from Augustine, right? So the I think, therefore I am, or the idea of identifying certainty in relation to doubt actually comes pretty much directly out of Augustine. So what's going on here, right? So Descartes was trying to find a point of certainty. Descartes wanted to find something that he could be certain about. And Descartes identified that with, as everyone knows, I think, therefore I am, right? And so Descartes basically was going to doubt everything, have hyperbolic doubt in regard to everything. And then the one thing that he couldn't doubt was that he was doubting. So doubting is a kind of cognition. So cogito, ergo sum. I am thinking, therefore I must exist. And from there, we come to an understanding of existence as this thinking thing. And existentialism arrives at certainty in a different way. Existentialism arrives at certainty by saying that it is certain that we will die. So if Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, the existentialists say, I will die, therefore I am. And let's take a look at Heidegger here. So I quote this on page 101 in the first volume of What is Existentialism? Heidegger tells us this passage is from The History of the Concept of Time. The mode of being, of falling, and that of course is falling into the world, is also a covering up. It operates by way of a reinterpretation, not letting itself see what death is. But this still implies a constant seeing beforehand, so that what it conceals in it is its own being. The inconspicuous concern of not thinking about death covers up a basic character in it, namely its certainty. This certainty is reinterpreted into uncertainty by means of the ambiguity of, quote, everyone dies someday, end quote. A statement about death which is really addressed to no one. And again, notice that would be a kind of identifying death with the other, right? And so I think that this is a real point of distinction, a real point of difference between the French and the German existentialists. And, perhaps we could go so far as to say between French and German thought, because clearly it's the case with the French thinkers that this is already present in Descartes. All right. So if we want to know how this works, right, and I think that this is such a beautiful passage in Heidegger's Being and Time. I wanted to take a look at it with you here, and just so we can get an understanding of how this works. So as beings, as being in any situation, as Dasein, as being here, as being there, we could say that we are a being that is always already in some situation, right? Anytime that we begin to think about ourselves, we are always already in a situation when we are thinking about ourselves. Okay, so Heidegger tells us then that when we are relating to the certainty of our own death, there is a sense in which we can anticipate our death. And by anticipating our own death, we are anticipating a kind of certainty. And so with that anticipation, we can say that anticipation is grounded in certainty. So it's no longer grounded in just imagination or something imaginal. It is actually grounded in something certain. And by grounding our thinking in something certain like that, it lights up, or it allows for the revelation of what Heidegger calls our ownmost potentiality. The idea is something like this, right? If I only have so much time to complete a task, right? So let's say there's a deadline that's coming. Everybody can identify with this, right? If there's a deadline that's coming and I only have so much time to complete that task, that my thinking about that deadline that's coming and my recognizing the inevitability of that deadline that is coming, right? It causes me anxiety, right? Of course, I become anxious about this, but that anxiety it can function as a kind of fuel for me to then get the things done that I am able to get done prior to the arrival of that deadline, right? And so there it is. So what we could say is that being toward that deadline, relating to that deadline by way of anticipation and resolving to meet that deadline, that engages our own potential in a way that if we are not paying attention to that deadline, that our potential is not engaged in the same way. When we're anticipating the deadline and we engage our potential and we resolve to meet this deadline, we resolve to do what we can before the deadline arrives, that is an authentic mode of being toward the deadline. And the deadline is inevitable. The deadline is coming anyway, right? But when we relate to that deadline in a way that denies the deadline or tries to be distracted from the coming of the deadline, then there's a sense in which we are not paying attention to our potential in the same way. We are not relating to our potential in the same way. And that is an inauthentic mode of being toward the deadline. And so we can just insert, instead of deadline, just say death. So according to Heidegger, this comes from section 53, part 2 of Being and Time, existential projection of an authentic being towards death. And Heidegger tells us, being towards death as anticipation of possibility is what first makes this possibility possible and sets it free as possibility. So we could say something like, I mean, I think he nails it there, but I'm going to try to just, in case that sounds too much like Dr. Seuss to you, I'm going to try to develop it a little bit for you. But I think that he said it perfectly. He just absolutely knocked it out of the park. But so what we could say is something like this, is that it's not until I take the inevitable, impending, approaching deadline seriously, it's not until I relate to its truth sincerely, right, that it is inescapable. It's not until I am able to relate to it seriously and to think about it sincerely and relate to it sincerely. It's not until then that I am able to see the truth of the situation that I am in. It is always already the case that we are temporary beings, that we are mortal, perhaps is the easier term to swallow. So we are always already mortal, and that we will die, that we will leave this world. We will no longer be in this world, but we are not dwelling in the world, or we are not being in the world in such a way that is aware of that, right? Until we become aware of it. This is why I wrote the book on Eastern existentialism, and I titled it "Living in the Light of Death." By anticipating one's death, that certainty, right? We have overcome Descartes' certainty. We have found the existential certainty, not the certainty of thought, but the certainty of existence. And by overcoming Descartes' certainty, by recognizing the certainty of existence, we can anticipate our own death. And when we are anticipating our own death, we are being toward death. And we can see then very clearly, and I think that this is the ground of all of this, is that we can see that there is an authentic way and an inauthentic way to be toward death. And when we are dwelling in the world before we recognize that we must die, before we begin to contemplate our own death, before we recognize and anticipate the certainty of our own death, then we could say that we are dwelling in the world with an inauthentic relation to our own death, right? We are living as though we will live in this world forever. So that would be an inauthentic way of relating to our death. This is why he says that the anticipation of the possibility of our death is what first makes this possibility possible and sets it free as a possibility. So we then are able to feel that anxiety. We then are able to contemplate our potentiality as temporary. I think that the deeper way to say this here might be to say something like this. Rather than merely, because there is some sense which we are always already being in a world, of course, but rather than merely see ourselves as being in a world, we are able to see ourselves as being in time. And when you're able to see yourself as being in time, then your being is lit up for you in a different way than merely the way that being is lit up for you when you are solely concerned with how the other sees you. So Heidegger tells us, I'm jumping forward a little bit here. It's Heidegger, page 263 in Sein und Zeit. Anticipation turns out to be the possibility of understanding one's own most and uttermost potentiality for being. That is to say, the possibility of authentic existence. Heidegger clarifies here. He says, it must be noted that understanding, right? We just said understanding one's own most and uttermost potentiality for being. He says, it must be noted that understanding does not primarily mean just gazing at a meaning, but rather understanding oneself in that potentiality for being, which reveals itself in projection. So when we recognize that the deadline is approaching, when we recognize that there are only so many tasks that can be performed between now and the arrival of that deadline, right? We're anticipating the inevitable arrival of this deadline. Once we recognize that, then we understand our current situation. We understand our current being in the world. Notice this does not take the other as a point of departure, right? This takes the certainty of death as the point of departure. And so once we are able to anticipate the inevitability of the arrival of this deadline, then we are able to understand our situation authentically. And understanding our situation authentically here, he uses the word projection. And of course, that this is the idea of what sorts of projects can I accomplish? What sorts of projects can I complete in the amount of time that is left? What sorts of projects are worth choosing, and what sort of projects must I leave behind, right? What sort of projects must I not choose? And when we are making those types of decisions in relation to death, this isn't the kind of situation in which you're saying something like, oh, well, I have forever to do this. And so therefore, the realization that I do not have forever to do this, and the understanding of being in time in that way, right? That is an authentic understanding of being in the world. And that is the German understanding of authenticity. All right. So, again, I really enjoy reading Dr. Cleary's book. I think that, as far as if I have some questions about Simone de Beauvoir, I would take them to Dr. Cleary first, right? I think that Dr. Cleary is an excellent Simone de Beauvoir scholar, and that she has a wonderful grip on Simone de Beauvoir's philosophy. And I don't think that she's wrong. I'm not saying that she's wrong. I don't think that she's wrong. I think that she's right about French authenticity. I think that she's right about the French existential understanding of authenticity. And, seeing her state this so sincerely, really, is what prompted me in some ways to say, oh, this is great, because I have really been focused on trying to articulate the difference between Sartre and Heidegger in regard to ontology. And it's pretty clear that both Sartre and Heidegger recognized that they were standing on different ground ontologically. I mean, Sartre is standing with Descartes in a kind of incoherent way, but that's okay. But I'm always focusing on their ontologies. But reading Dr. Cleary's book really helped me think about them in terms of something less constitutional and more actualizational, right? Or something more involving an actualization principle of existentialism, or authenticity specifically. All right, so I'm happy that I was able to sort of put that together briefly in a podcast episode. If you have questions or comments about that, pop over to the Sartre video on YouTube and leave a comment for me, and I'd be happy to respond to it. All right. We are selling books on Amazon, courses on Gumroad, hosting videos on YouTube, and memes on X. And if you'd like to see the Philosophemes in puzzle form, check us out on Instagram. As always, I welcome your questions and comments on YouTube. Thank you for sharing and supporting this open access educational podcast.
Ever heard of Stoicism? Chances are, if you have, you've heard of Stoicism with a lowercase s and not Stoicism with an uppercase S. Lone wolves, no emotions, antisocial behavior, cold indifference. All that is Stoicism with a lowercase s. Stoicism with an uppercase S is the ancient Greek philosophy and virtue ethics framework that centers on service to the cosmopolis, to include your family, friends, community, and planet, and the development of a good moral character. My name is Tanner Campbell, and I'm the host of Practical Stoicism, a 3 times a week podcast teaching Stoic principles and concepts to anyone interested through the exploration of texts and deep dives into various moral topics. You can find Practical Stoicism where you're already listening to podcasts by searching for Practical Stoicism or by going to stoicismpod.com. I invite you to give it a listen today. You just might like it.
This is Mark.
And this is Wes.
We'd like to tell you about Close Reads,
a philosophy podcast where we comment on philosophy texts in real time.
We give you the experience of reading very difficult verbiage without you having to actually do that.
We cover the big names and the figures you've always wanted to know more about.
And share our insights from 15 years running the Partially Examined Life podcast, downloaded over 50 million times.
Join us
on Close Reads.